What does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? I was curious to learn more about each of the three parts of this question, of this kind of encouragement. And so I looked up a few different translations of this verse to see what we could learn from what the differences are and how different scholars have translated different words. So the first part, do justice, it's pretty consistent. The translations all get at the idea of acting for fairness, like Connie was talking about, focusing on acting for justice or rightness, those things. It's pretty consistent. Similarly, the last one, walk humbly with God, was consistent across the translations. This third instruction is clearly about being humble and turning to God, relying on God. But the middle instruction, it shows up in a few different forms. Shay just read the Common English Bible version of it, which says to embrace faithful love. Our call to worship used what we call the New Revised Standard Version, which puts it to love kindness. Another translation says to love mercy. So this middle instruction, it's one where the translations vary. And maybe that's because the writer of Micah is not just pointing to some vague notion of kindness or a vague notion of mercy or a vague notion of love, but Micah's getting to a very specific understanding of these things. The Hebrew word for it is hesed. I'm going to say that not quite right, but hesed. Throughout the Old Testament, this word hesed, it appears most often referring not to human action, not to human kindness or mercy or love, but it refers predominantly to the loving faithfulness, the loving kindness of God. In fact, it appears 250 times in the Hebrew scriptures, this word hesed. The Old Testament is a string of stories of God's hesed, God's loving kindness, God's mercy that is rooted in God's faithful love. Putting all of this together, my Old Testament professor would assert that hesed is the overarching theme of the entire Hebrew Bible, that it's the point, that it's the thesis that God is making. And then Christians believe that God sends Jesus as hesed in the flesh, as an embodiment of God's loving kindness, of God's mercy, of God's faithful love, because we needed to see it in a person to get what God had been saying over and over and over again for so many years. And of course, we still need to get it. Sometimes we still miss it. And so our call is still to look for God's hesed and to love hesed like Micah tells us. Our faithful loving kindness is rooted in God's. It starts in God's. God's faithful love for us opens us, and it leads us to show faithful love to others.